The global automotive market has, for all intents and purposes, fractured. We're now operating in a world where investors are playing by two completely different sets of rules, creating what we can only describe as two distinct valuation universes. In this analysis, we're going to dig into this fundamental structural shift to really understand how one car company can be valued like a mature industrial, while another is treated like a high-growth tech firm.
So, here's our central thesis, right up front. The global auto market is no longer one single cohesive entity. It is split cleanly into two, and we're calling this phenomenon the Great Bifurcation. And this slide really lays out these two parallel universes. On one side, you've got legacy auto. The market is assessing them based on traditional industrial metrics, things like stable earnings, predictable margins. But on the other side, you have the NEV tech world. These companies are being valued as high-growth technology plays, where the focus is all on future potential and market disruption. These are just fundamentally different worlds, and they're driven by entirely different financial expectations.
Okay, so here's our roadmap. We'll start by defining this bifurcation in more detail. Then, we're going to follow the capital flows to see how the major markets are diverging. We'll pinpoint the Q3 earnings season as the key catalyst, and then we'll get into decoding the huge valuation gap that's opened up. From there, we'll shift to China's new competitive models before wrapping it all up with 4 key structural shifts you need to know about.
So let's get right to the core of this shift. The market's appetite for ambitious narratives and future promises has faded. What's replaced it is a laser focus on one thing: financial discipline. It's the cold hard numbers that are now driving the conversation.
And you can see the market's new rules right here, crystallized by the recent Q3 earnings season. Capital is flowing towards two things. First, the profit stability of U.S. legacy OEMs. And second, business models with verifiable profitability, like what we're seeing with Huawei and Ceres. At the same time, the market is punishing margin compression at companies like Tesla, and it's punishing the clear loss of market share that's hitting European and Japanese legacy brands.
All right, let's zoom out now for a more global perspective. We're going to look at how this is all playing out across the 3 major automotive capital markets, because each one is now on a very different trajectory. Now, the first thing this chart makes obvious is the sheer scale of the US market. It absolutely dwarfs its Hong Kong and A-share counterparts. But as you're about to see, size isn't the whole story here. It's the composition of that market that's really key.
Because when you look under the hood of the US market, you see what we're calling the Tesla gravity effect. Just one company, Tesla, accounts for a staggering 70% of the total market capitalization. What that means is the performance of the entire US auto sector is almost completely tethered to the performance of a single stock.
So what exactly triggered this huge reevaluation by the market? Well, the data all points to one event: the Q3 earnings season. It sent a shockwave through the system and kicked off a massive rotation of capital.
The data for October tells a very clear story. You had legacy players like GM and Ford seeing their valuations rise after they beat earnings expectations. At the same time, former growth darlings like Li Auto and Ceres took a significant hit. This is a textbook example of an earnings-driven sector rotation, where capital is moving away from high-growth narratives and towards companies delivering solid, verifiable profits today.
Let's use Li Auto as a quick case study, because it illustrates this point perfectly. The market is now showing basically zero tolerance for any underperformance on core fundamental metrics like vehicle deliveries.
And here's the number that really set off the alarms: a 38% drop in year-over-year deliveries. In a market where competitors were posting records, a miss of this magnitude simply does not go unnoticed.
All of this brings us to the enormous valuation gap we're seeing across the industry, and it raises the critical question for investors and analysts alike: how do you distinguish between a genuine value opportunity and what's known as a value trap?
So what exactly is a value trap? Well, it's a stock that looks cheap on the surface. Maybe it has a low price-to-earnings ratio. But the reason it's cheap is because the underlying business fundamentals are deteriorating. So despite looking like a bargain, its price just continues to slide. Now, this table is where everything comes into focus. It shows the sharp disconnect between valuation metrics and actual financial fundamentals. For example, look at GM and Toyota. They have very similar low PE ratios, but GM beat its earnings, which suggests the market may be reevaluating it as a solid value play. Toyota, meanwhile, saw operating income fall sharply, a classic sign of a potential value trap. And then, way over on the other end of the spectrum, you have Tesla, with a massive PE ratio that seems completely divorced from its collapsing operating margin. It's just clear proof that it's being judged by a completely different set of rules. Okay, let's turn our focus now to China. It's more than just the world's largest auto market. At this point, it's become a laboratory, a place where entirely new business models are being pioneered that could have implications for the entire global industry.
And a prime example of this is the Huawei Tech Empowerment Model. In this partnership with the automaker Ceres, Huawei brings the core technology, the brand power, and the retail network to the table. Ceres, in turn, can just focus on what it does best, manufacturing. The result is a new kind of partnership that's asset-light, highly profitable, and very scalable.
I think this quote perfectly captures the dynamic inside China's domestic EV space right now. The era when a rising tide would lift all the new entrants, well, that's over. The market is now becoming brutally selective about picking winners and losers.
And you can see this divergence playing out so clearly. On one hand, you have recovery stories, like NIO and XPeng. The market is rewarding them for finally crossing that crucial margin inflection point, the moment they start heading toward profitability. But on the other hand, you have a warning signal from Li Auto. A company that was once a leader in profitability is now seeing a sudden decline, which really underscores the intense competitive pressure coming from new rivals like Aido.
So, after looking at all this data, what are the main takeaways? Let's synthesize this whole analysis down to 4 key structural shifts that are now defining the new automotive landscape. First, this split in valuation logic between legacy auto and NEV tech, it's not temporary. It appears to be a permanent feature of the market. Second, capital is now chasing verified profitability, not just compelling growth stories. Third, even within the legacy world, there's a clear split between the profit-stable companies undergoing a value re-rating and those that are becoming value traps. And finally, we're seeing the validation of a third paradigm, the tech empowerment model emerging from China.
And all of this leaves us with one critical forward-looking question. As these two distinct valuation universes continue to drift further apart, which of these business models is going to prove the most resilient over the next decade? The stable industrial, the high-growth tech disruptor, or the asset-light partnership?